Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. Last couple of videos we've been talking about fighting rifle cartridges. Started with the 5.56 or the 223. Talked about the 300 black, the next most common cartridge to be chambered in an AR platform. Then the big one, the battle rifle, the 7.62 NATO, M14 rifles, M24 sniper rifle systems, and our general purpose machine guns and the M134 minigun. So we're going through a lot of 7.62 ammo in this country every year, and if you need a powerful rifle, that's an outstanding choice for you to make. I want to flip to the opposite end of the spectrum here and talk about the US 30 carbine. Very, very small compared to that old M2 ball that the Grands used in World War II. Is it a viable self-defense fighting rifle cartridge? Stick around, we'll talk about it. Okay, the 30 US carbine cartridge was conceived in this country just before World War II. Winchester was working with the US Army to develop a light rifle program, and their goal was a very light, intermediate powered cartridge that would be about half the weight of an M1 Garand or a Thompson submachine gun, the two primary weapons that were used by infantry and other warfighters in World War II. And in about 1941, October of 41 to be exact, the M1 carbine was adopted and the cartridge for it. This was an adaptation of the Winchester 32 self-loading cartridge that was used in their 1905 model semi-automatic rifle. They adapted the cartridge to a .308 caliber bullet, same as the 30-06. It has a 110 grain, rather sharply pointed full metal jacket. Not a Spitzer bullet by any means, but not as blunt as, say, a 45 ACP round. The carbine had an 18-inch barrel, and it developed a muzzle velocity of about 1990 feet per second, so just below 2,000 feet per second with a 110 grain bullet. The design of the carbine included a kind of a new concept, a short stroke gas piston. And that gas piston system was not serviceable by users. It's not one that can be torn down like the M1 Garand. You're going to get into the gas system if you need to and clean parts. So they were concerned that non-corrosive primers could put these M1 carbines on the sidelines pretty quickly. So M1 carbine ammunition loaded by the United States from the get-go has always been loaded with non-corrosive primers. Now, non-corrosive primers were not known to be really reliable in the era of the 1940s. Especially in high humidity conditions, you'd get some failure to fires. But they thought that was a trade-off with keeping that short gas piston working instead of letting it corrode up with the salts that result from corrosive type primers. So any U.S. head-stamped carbine ammunition, you don't have to worry about it being corrosive. None of it was ever loaded with corrosive primers. The other cartridges, the M2 ball, the 45 ACP, they had the more reliable corrosive primers until well after World War II, when the technology of the primers was improved. When the carbine is zeroed at 100 yards, the bullet drops about 13 inches at 200 yards. So this is by no means a flat shooting long distance cartridge. Most of the M1 carbines had sights that were calibrated at 1, 2, and 300 yards. I've played with some of those, and at 300 yards you can hit a steel silhouette target with one. Not every time, maybe. But they will get there, and they will hit. They will not hit particularly hard. A lot of soldiers were not happy with the hard-hitting ability of the 30 carbine at any range. And there were a lot of them who had carbines to begin with that would leave them behind and do a battlefield pickup for an M1 Garand if they thought that's what they needed. U.S. Carbine initially came with a 15-round detachable box magazine, and a late friend of mine who used one quite a bit in Korea said that he thought the unreliability complaints about the M1 Carbine mostly traced to the magazines. He said the magazines were not really robust. Feed lips were prone to get damaged, so he said whenever he could get his hands on some new magazines, he would grab them and throw the old ones away. In 1944, a variation came out from the M1. It was called the M2, and it had a select fire switch. So we have full auto capability, and those came with a 30-round magazine. The 15s were straight. The 30s were kind of bent, take up the taper of the cartridge, very much like the M16. M16s first had straight 20-round magazines, and then the 30s have to have some bend to them to work with the taper of the cartridge. Another variation, even before the M2 Carbine came out, was the M1A1, and the difference with that was a wire shoulder stock that would fold out of the way, and it was designed for paratroopers so that they could put it in a rather small case when they jumped, hit the ground, fold their stock out, and have a usable M1 Carbine. The other variation out there that I have seen on the surplus market in the past, but not for quite a while, was the M3 Carbine. The M3 came about in, I believe, 1945. Its first use during World War II was on the battle for Okinawa. The M3 had an infrared scope mounted on it, optical scope, and an infrared spotlight that sat atop that, so it projected out as much infrared light as they could for the technology. And then that scope only saw in the infrared spectrum. The downside to this carbine was the range. It was limited to about 70 yards effective range. And the backpack that the poor guy had to wear that weighed 20-some pounds, that carried batteries to be able to power that scope and that infrared spotlight. But it gave them vision in total darkness. So the M3s were put out on listening posts, frontline posts on Okinawa, and when the Japanese would try to sneak in on dark nights, they could spot them about 50 to 75 yards out with these infrared systems, fire accurately with the crosshairs, make a couple of hits, and their firing, of course, would alert the rest of the line of U.S. troops. And so they, as technology went, this was as bare bones as night vision could be, but they worked. And they were used pretty effectively in the Korean War as well. When the carbines were used in Korea, especially in that brutal winter that our troops had to live through, the carbines developed more of a reputation of being unreliable. And I think under Arctic conditions, almost any semi-automatic rifle is going to be taxed to its utmost. The lubrication can congeal, sometimes even freeze. And one story going around is that the cartridge was so ineffective that when the Chinese entered the war, and under Arctic conditions, they were wearing several layers of quilted fabric coats. And there is the wives' tale out there that the .30 carbine would not even penetrate all those layers of heavy clothing and were ineffective against the Chinese soldiers. It's difficult to pin down someone who was actually there who will admit to saying that. And when we've tested .30 carbines now, we test them against some heavy clothing and some other intermediate barriers. This little round penetrates pretty well. I kind of find it hard to believe that it wouldn't penetrate, an inch of clothing. So, the Arctic conditions certainly are going to lower the muzzle velocity, and who knows? It's not a powerhouse. This is really, in one respect, I think the M1 carbine could be called the first semi-automatic pistol caliber carbine, because this really is not a lot more than a Magnum pistol cartridge. And in fact, the .30 carbine has been chambered in a number of revolvers and semi-auto handguns along the way, so it works fairly well as a pistol cartridge. In terms of power, it compares fairly close to a .357 Magnum fired from a carbine-length barrel, 18 or 20-inch barrel. So I would put it into the Magnum pistol caliber carbine category. It's not really a true rifle, however you want to stretch that. Millions of these things were made in World War II. There were 10 primary contractors, names as obscure as Rockola, the jukebox company, was making them. Inland, a division of General Motors, made hundreds of thousands. Winchester made an awful lot of them because they were the first producer. They were involved in the development of it, and so they had the first tooling and were ready to go. Many of these things have been sold in the United States on the surplus market. Some of them were sold directly by what would be the Civilian Marksmanship Program now. Back then it was called the Director of Civilian DCM, Director of Civilian Marksmanship. Some of them had been given to other countries. We used them here in our military into the 70s probably, and gave them to a lot of allies, and a lot of those carbines went overseas, had a life in some other country, and they will have proof marks from other countries when they went into their system, and then a lot of times were bought back as surplus arms. So there are literally millions of these things out in the hands of people in the United States. The semi-auto versions, the M2s are rather unusual. I had a chance to fire an M2 one time, but I've not seen a lot of them out there on the market. The point is, this can be a pretty decent little home defense gun. It's effective out to 100 yards, maybe a little bit more. The full metal jacket is not a great idea. It's great for training if you can get them cheap, and surplus ammo has become almost impossible to find. And commercial ammo is as expensive as everything else. The 110 grain soft points and hollow points that are available for this, you need to check them in your rifle, make sure it's going to feed them okay. These things perform very well. They typically expand out to 45 to 50 caliber. They'll penetrate 14 to 16 inches of 10% gelatin. The wound cavity looks kind of like a 30-30 soft point. They're not nearly as powerful as a 30-30, but they're not that far behind it. So if you have a good, reliable carbine, it can make a really good home defense weapon. You can take off the top handguard now, put a Picatinny rail on there, mount a red dot sight. You can mount flashlights on them if you wish. So you can bring these things up to the modern accoutrements that we like in a fighting rifle. To go out and buy a carbine as a home defense or personal defense rifle, I don't think is probably a good idea. There are two companies in the United States currently making them. Inland, which is not a part of General Motors anymore, they just use the name Inland. And Auto Ordnance Group is making them as well. I've heard fairly good reports from both of them, but I've also talked to some people who are not happy with their production. Most of the World War II era carbines are going to be good if they are all matching parts and things. In other words, they have collector value. You better take your checkbook with you. If you can find one that has various parts that have been reassembled, maybe by CMP, then make sure it's a good shooter. But if it is, it's a reliable carbine. But you're probably going to pay $1,000 even for a shooter grade World War II, and $1,000 or more for one of the new productions. For that $1,000, you can buy a pretty decent AR-15. In fact, I've seen bargain basement AR-15s by even Colt and Smith & Wesson for $500 or $600. So if you're going to go spend money on a fighting rifle, I think I'd go with a 5.56 myself instead of a carbine. But if you have one, thanks to your father or grandfather or someone buying one surplus, and it's a good reliable rifle, it can be a really nice little home defense gun. These things are 5 pounds, they're short, they're handy. Kids, women can shoot them easily. And it's just a fun little cartridge to use. I mentioned the M2 carbine coming on the scene in 1944. That was the select fire. And if we look at assault, this true definition of assault rifles, not the AR-15 definition that our mainstream media wants to give us here in the country now, a true assault rifle uses an intermediate power cartridge and is capable of select fire, semi-auto or full auto. And a lot of people point to the German Sturmgewehr STG-44, and they say that is the first true assault rifle. The STG-44 used a little 7.9 by 33 cartridge. Some call it the 8mm short. It has only slightly more power than the 30 US carbine. And the 30 US carbine predates it by just a little bit in 1944 if you look at the M2 variation, which has that select fire capability. So while I might argue that this was the first semi-auto pistol caliber carbine, you could also argue that this was the first true assault rifle. Intermediate power cartridge, capability of full auto fire. Then, of course, the one that came on the scene after World War II and was undoubtedly influenced by the German cartridge is the 7.62x39. Now, it has about 40% more energy than either the German 7.9 short or the 30 carbine. So it's a substantially more powerful cartridge. And there is no question that it fits into the assault rifle category. But I think we could argue that the M1, M2 carbine could be called an assault rifle. So, while the M1 carbine cartridge does not have a stellar reputation as a man-stopper, it does a really good job with 110 grain soft points. As I said, it's 5 pounds. It's almost like shooting a .22 rifle. It is that easy. And if 100 yards is all the reach you're going to need to defend your home or your family, and you have a good carbine, you don't need to go out and spend money on another rifle. But as I said, if you're going to spend money for another rifle, I don't think the M1 carbine is a good choice, simply for what you're going to have to pay for a good copy of a rifle with that system. And the ammo is considerably more expensive than 5.56 because there's just so little of it being loaded nowadays. So, the 30 carbine is a neat little potential for home defense. What's next? Well, I think next we need to look to our enemies and see what they've developed. 7.62x39, to a lesser degree, the 5.45x39 cartridge, created by the Soviets, now the Russians. These are pretty popular in the United States, so I'm going to talk about them next time. The Soviet cartridges, how do they fit into the U.S. picture of a fighting rifle, home defense, ranch defense? That's what we're going to talk about. Folks, I appreciate you watching these videos. My numbers are going up on both subscribers and views, and I appreciate that. An honor when people pay attention to what I have to say. So I want to thank you for that. Be safe out there. I'll see you next time.
Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, Bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.